Here's maybe the most important thing to get right. BRICS is not a military alliance like NATO. There's no founding treaty holding them together. It's much better to think of it as a strategic forum, a club where these major emerging economies get together to make their collective voice louder on the world stage, completely outside the old-school Western power structure.
And wow, has this club been growing. It started with the original five, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. But recently, a massive expansion just brought in some huge new players, like Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, creating what people are now calling BRICS Plus. And this wasn't just about adding more seats at the table, it was a huge strategic move that totally expanded the bloc's global reach.
And the scale of this thing is just staggering. When you put all the BRICS nations together, they are home to roughly 45% of the entire world's population. Just think about that for a second. We're talking about nearly half of all humanity represented in just one group.
And their economic muscle is just as impressive. If you measure it by something called purchasing power parity, which is just a fancy way of comparing what money can actually buy in different countries, the BRICS bloc now makes up around 40% of the entire global economy.
But their power isn't just about money. It's also about resources. As you can see here, the BRICS nations control a massive slice of the world's food production and farmland. This makes the bloc an absolutely central player when it comes to global food security.
So, how in the world did this powerhouse come to be? Well, the origin story is definitely not what you'd expect. Believe it or not, it didn't start in some stuffy diplomatic summit, but on the trading floor of an investment bank.
You can see the whole journey right here. Back in 2001, BRIC was literally just a catchy buzzword for investors. But by 2009, the countries themselves were like, hey, we like that, and they held their first official summit. Then they added South Africa, turning BRIC into BRICS. And then came the really crucial part. In 2014, they started building their own financial institutions. This latest expansion is just the next big chapter in this incredible evolution.
But here's a fascinating little twist. The man who actually invented the term, an economist named Jim O'Neill, has kind of become one of its biggest critics. He basically argues that for all its big meetings and fancy statements, the group really struggles to get anything concrete done. He more or less dismisses it as a lot of talk and not a lot of action. It's a really important critical perspective to keep in your back pocket.
So, is it just talk? Well, the bloc's biggest answer to that accusation lies in its most concrete achievement, the construction of a whole parallel financial system. Let's take a look at the architecture here.
The crown jewel of this whole effort is the New Development Bank, or the NDB. It was set up from day one to be an alternative to the Western-led World Bank and IMF. It offers loans for big infrastructure and development projects, but, and this is key, without all the political strings that are so often attached by those older institutions.
And the way the NDB is set up is what makes it so different. It's based in Shanghai, it's got a massive $100 billion capital base, and a really strong focus on climate-friendly projects. And, super important, it can lend in its members' own currencies, which helps them rely less on the US dollar. But maybe the biggest deal of all? No single country has veto power. It's designed to be a much more equal partnership.
This brings us to the big one, right? The de-dollarization question. It's one of the things people talk about most when it comes to BRICS. So how exactly are they planning to chip away at the dominance of the US dollar in the global economy?
Well, it's not just one thing. It's a multi-pronged attack. First, they are doing way more trade with each other using their own local currencies. Second, they're building something called BRICS Pay to connect all their national payment systems, basically creating an alternative to systems like SWIFT. And the third step, the most ambitious one, is testing a brand new digital currency. They're calling it the unit, which could let them settle trades directly, completely sidestepping the dollar.
So, when you put all of this together, the expansion, this new bank, the challenge to the dollar, you start to get to the really big question. What is the endgame here? Well, it's about nothing less than trying to reshape the entire global power structure. This slide really lays out the two competing visions pretty clearly. On one hand, you have the current system, which was largely built after World War II. It's centered on Western institutions like the G7 and the power of the US dollar. On the other hand, you have the BRICS vision for what they call a multipolar world, with lots of different centers of power. They want to reform those old institutions to give countries in the global south a much bigger say.
And here is the hard economic reality that's driving this whole thing. For decades, the G7 nations were the undisputed engine of the world economy. But this simple chart shows a massive change.
Measured by purchasing power, the BRICS economies combined are now actually bigger than the G7. The economic center of gravity has literally shifted.
But, and this is a huge but for any good analysis, the bloc is facing massive hurdles from within. You've got major rivalries, especially between India and China. The members have completely different political systems, and China's economy is just so huge, it dwarfs all the other members combined. And look, while it might be easy enough to agree on building a bank, trying to get a consensus on thorny geopolitical issues, that's way, way harder.
So after all that, what's the key takeaway here? What's the one thing you really need to remember from all this?
Here's the bottom line. What started as a catchy term for investors has morphed into a real-deal political and economic project. It's not just an idea anymore. It's an active geopolitical force that is seriously trying to build an alternative to the world order we've known for decades.